This week, I sat down with one of the most clinically knowledgeable physicians on medicinal cannabis in the US, Dr. David Bearman. Dr. Bearman has been travelling the country giving presentations on the benefits of medicinal cannabis to politicians as well as to top medical health professionals. In this podcast, we discuss the multitude of benefits cannabis has as a medicine. Dr. Bearman's book, Drugs Are Not the Devil's Tools, How Discrimination and Greed Created a Dysfunctional Drug Policy and How It Can Be Fixed, will be linked in the show notes below. Before we get into it, a quick shout out to Genocide for letting us use their track Wake Up, featuring Debt Collectors. You can follow these guys on Facebook or download via iTunes.
Soldiers, don't give yourselves to brutes. Men who despise you, enslave you, who regiment your lives, tell you what to do, what to think, and what to feel, who drill you, diet you, treat you like cattle, use you as cannon fodder. Don't give yourselves to these unnatural men with machine minds and machine hearts. Yeah. You are not machines, you are not cattle, you are men.
Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up.
Dr. Bearman, thank you very much for making the time out of your very busy schedule to sit down and have a quick chat with us. How's your time been so far?
I have been very impressed and really appreciate the hospitality of the people here in New Zealand, and also the enthusiasm and intelligence and drive and determination to reform cannabis laws here in New Zealand.
Excellent. So currently in New Zealand, polls show that about 80 to 90% of people support legalisation of cannabis medicinally. What would you say as a medical professional that some of the benefits of cannabis are?
Well, I think one of the things with cannabis is that it has a very broad spectrum of application. And in some ways, that is a handicap because it's hard for physicians to understand and appreciate that any one substance can have as many therapeutic benefits as cannabis can. And I'll give you a few, and maybe we can sort of stop in the middle because the list is quite lengthy. As we know, pain or analgesia is a long time use of cannabis. Treatment of anxiety, treatment of insomnia, treatment of gastrointestinal disorder, irritable bowel syndrome, and ulcerative colitis. But we've also found that it's very useful in dealing with mental health issues, with depression, with autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. Of course, most people are familiar with its effectiveness in treating seizures, usefulness in treating migraines. And one of the things that we have come to find out in the last 15, 20 years, well, actually, since 1974, is that cannabis kills cancer cells. And I hesitate to say that because people say, well, nothing could do that. Nothing could take care of that. And there's a number of research studies, which we'll talk about some of the review articles later regarding that. But I have never felt more like a physician than I have since I started practicing cannabinoid medicine in 2001. I mean, I've seen people with an enormously wide variety of conditions come in who benefit from cannabis. One of the ones that I neglected to mention was neurodegenerative disease, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Cannabis is neuroprotective. If you have a stroke or traumatic brain injury and you have cannabinoids on board, you're going to have less neurological damage than if you don't. The amount of misinformation and lies about cannabis is monumental, and it's truly unfortunate, because as you are well aware, here we have a therapeutic substance that we know has been used to treat people for 4,000 years. So there's been some very successful propaganda over the last 120 years that really amount to one of the most successful big lie campaigns that we've ever seen.
Most certainly, and it's crazy that in 2017, the age of information, we're still battling so hard to get this information out there and to get real change in our legislative process for cannabis to now be legal is so tough.
And I think that you see physicians, and I hate to denigrate my fellow colleagues and politicians being aggressively ignorant and trying as hard as they can to avoid the evidence. I mean, all you have to do as a clinician is to sit at your desk and look across the table at people who come in and they see me every year for an evaluation and tell me what the benefits that they receive for their pain, for their arthritis, for their autoimmune disease. The list goes on and on. And they're able to, in many cases, stop using the prescription medications that they have or decrease them. And cannabis has far fewer side effects than the prescription medication. It frankly is criminal that we have these laws against cannabis. And, if we're going to lock anybody up, it ought to be the politicians.
Oh, I totally agree. It's a shame that a lot of the evidence is anecdotal because of how the system's been over, the past 50 years, where a lot of the research hasn't actually been able to take place because of the scheduling in America, Schedule 1. Is cannabis still Schedule 1 in America?
Yes, cannabis is Schedule 1. And you have this sort of bizarre dichotomy where the federal government says that cannabis has no known medical use in the United States. And then you have 29 states that have legalized the medical use of cannabis. So what's going on here? I mean, we have this schizophrenia. And by the way, cannabis can treat psychosis, not cause psychosis. Almost everything that has been said about psychosis in terms of its significant adverse effects is wrong. It's about 180 degrees out of whack. And I would say to any of your listeners, if you have a serious condition like ulcerative colitis or migraines or seizures or cancer, you ought to try cannabis. It's not going to hurt you. I mean, in 1988, after a 2-year rescheduling hearing, the DEA's chief administrative law judge not only recommended rescheduling cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2, but also in his finding of fact, said that cannabis was one of the safest therapeutic agents known to man. I mean, this is all really absurd. And when one goes back to try to discern what the reason is, certainly discrimination and greed are probably the two most compelling reasons. William Randolph Hearst, who, for reasons that I'm not clear, had a strong anti-Spanish streak, he helped stir up the enthusiasm for the Spanish-American War, which propelled the United States into being an imperialistic power. And then when the Mexican Revolution occurred in 1910, he started popularizing the term marijuana, to which most Americans didn't know what he was talking about. They had no idea that he was talking about cannabis, that he was talking about hemp. And then in 1937, when we had the Marijuana Tax Act, DuPont, acting as sort of a point person for the petrochemical industry, was very concerned about the economic viability of hemp. And the Marijuana Tax Act had nothing to do with marijuana and everything to do with hemp. And the reason I know that is that the American Medical Association testified against the Marijuana Tax Act. They said they had not been contacted in the 2 years that the law had been prepared in secret, as characterized by the American Medical Association. So obviously it had nothing to do with health, and it had everything to do with DuPont's concern about hemp being used to make synthetic fiber that might compete with nylon or rayon, or synthetic that might compete with cellulose. I also were concerned because they were the largest shareholder in General Motors, and Ford was making a car that was made almost entirely out of hemp, that had an acrylic that was embedded with hemp. The upholstery was made with hemp. It ran on hemp ethanol. Henry Ford, the automobile industrialist, always thought that cars would run on ethanol, probably hemp ethanol. And in addition to that, DuPont made tetraethyl lead, which was an additive for gasoline. So they had incredible motivation. There's this enormous amount of circumstantial evidence that DuPont was the prime mover behind the Marijuana Tax Act. And to blame Hearst and Harry Anslinger, who were certainly both despicable characters in this story, is to give them way more credit and power than they deserve. After all, the Marijuana Tax Act was carried by a representative from North Carolina named Robert Doughton, who frequently was an errand boy for DuPont. So we don't have any smoking gun to say that it was DuPont, but the circumstantial evidence certainly seems, if not enough to convict Mr. Lamont DuPont, then pretty close to being able to convict him.
Because there's some serious vested interests here and a lot of profit at stake for a lot of these companies. So, of course, their interest is in protecting that future viability of their companies. And hemp was this wonder crop, $1 billion crop, which threatened their entire business model. So, of course, they're going to try and shut that out. And
it's interesting you should mention the title, The $1 Billion Crop, because that appeared in 1938 in Popular Mechanics, not particularly known as a radical rag, touting that hemp was going to be the next big industrial crop, which it was not the first time. In 1916, the U.S. Department of Agriculture issued Bulletin 404 saying that hemp was going to make a comeback. And when they talk about hemp making a comeback, it was the most profitable agricultural crop for 1,000 years until 1880, when the steamships sort of dimmed the demand for canvas sail and rigging. And cotton, of course, had started to make a comeback in the 1830s as a result of the invention of the cotton gin. So, I mean, there was every reason for large industrial concerns to be worried about having economical hemp be available to make paper, to make natural fiber, synthetic fiber, to make ethanol, frankly, to make synthetic skins for automobiles that was much lighter than steel. And I've read two different things. One said it was 15 times stronger than steel. Another said it was 100 times stronger than steel. And this was an acrylic that was embedded with hemp. I mean, it's really disturbing. And of course, most Americans knew what hemp was. They knew what cannabis was. And they really had no idea what marijuana was. And there was this peculiar ambiguity where marijuana was illegal in the 1920s in over half the states in the U.S., whereas cannabis was one of the most common ingredients in medicines, and 3 million prescriptions were written a year in the 1920s by American physicians, and there were 30 over-the-counter preparations that contained cannabis, alongside the fact that marijuana was illegal. And of course, marijuana, cannabis, and hemp are all exactly the same thing.
Most certainly. I want to go back to the medicinal benefits in New Zealand. So doctors came out recently and said between 40 and 60% of their patients are using cannabis for treating their cancer symptoms. Do you think that medicinal cannabis should only be available to, say, the terminally ill, or do you think it also should be available to, say, people who are having trouble sleeping, who have back pain, migraines, or do you think it should be just fully legalized and available to anyone who wants to smoke it?
I think that the late Dr. Todd Mikaria had it correct. In Proposition 215, which legalized medical cannabis, there's a list of symptoms and conditions for which cannabis can be recommended by a physician, plus the catch-all for whatever condition the physician feels that the cannabis may be useful. After all, we have 4 years of undergraduate training, we have 4 years of medical school training, we have a rotating internship, we have residency. One would think that the general public would think that physicians know what they're doing, and I certainly think that most physicians know what they're doing, and why should we treat cannabis any differently than we do any other medication, where we have the ability to write it for just about anything that we think that it might be useful for, as long as we can justify it. And we certainly can justify the use of cannabis as a medicine. So the short answer to your question is, I think anybody who would benefit from the use of cannabis should be able to obtain it. Now, one has to be careful when we're talking about medicinal cannabis to avoid conflating the medicinal use with the recreational use. And I think that it undermines my credibility as a physician to discuss medical use and recreational use at the same time. Sure. That said, I believe that we need massive drug policy reform, as just about every international commission full of dignified mainstream politicians has concluded the drug war has been an abysmal failure. Okay. And in the United States, it's probably cost $1 trillion. It's probably ruined millions of lives, and it has undermined the United States Constitution. It's undermined confidence and faith in law enforcement. It's disproportionately led to the arrest and incarceration of significant minorities, such as the Hispanics and African Americans. So there has really been absolutely no good from the drug war, and recognize that in the majority of the history of the United States, there were no laws against the use of any substances. We really had the federal government weigh in 1914 with the Harrison Narcotic Tax Act, which really was a challenge to the Ninth and 10th Amendment to the Constitution, which are states' rights. After all, the states have the authority to regulate the practice of medicine, not the federal government. And anybody that's interested in seeing a more erudite legal argument would be well served by looking at the dissents in a case called Gonzalez versus Raich that were written by Sandra Day O'Connor, who's since retired, and the late Chief Justice William Rehnquist and Clarence Thomas, all of whom are well-known conservatives and all of whom supported states' rights and all of whom said the state of California had the right to regulate the practice of medicine. And if they wanted to let Miss Raich, who had a meningioma, a space-occupying mass benign tumor in the lining of the brain, that she had the right to grow cannabis in her backyard and use it in her living room. She was not transporting it across state lines, and that the federal government had no such constitutional authority to regulate cannabis. And certainly that's the way it ought to be. I mean, if the federal government wants to regulate interstate commerce, so be it. But let's not blow up the Constitution and interfere with the regulation of the practice of medicine, which is clearly states' rights. Now, a lot of us that grew up in the 40s and 50s and 60s recognize that states' rights is a code word for racism. And Paul Krasner, who is a satirist that had a magazine called The Realist, wrote a piece about 10 or 15 years ago regarding medicinal cannabis. And he facetiously and wryly noted when it comes to cannabis that states' rights is no longer for racists anymore.
Wow, absolutely amazing. Yeah. So do you, as a medical professional, what do you think are the safest ways to ingest or smoke cannabis? Because there's a lot of concern, or I'd even say misinformation about the dangers of smoking, say, like a joint, in terms of being compared to tobacco smoke and tobacco tar and having damage on the lungs. What are your thoughts on ingesting marijuana smoke compared to, say, a vaporizer or ingesting orally?
Certainly. Well, I do believe that a vaporizer has less irritation, but it has about 70% fewer irritants. And of course, you're not combusting the cannabis, so you don't have any problems with the products of combustion. But in terms of dangers from smoking cannabis, the three chief dangers are increased cough, increased sputum production, and increased bronchial irritation. Now, there's a well-known pulmonologist who's a professor at UCLA, a fairly prominent medical school in California in the United States, named Donald Tashkin. And Tashkin has received several grants from the National Institute of Drug Abuse, whose mission is to prove how awful drugs are. And Tashkin assumed, and Tashkin is a very reputable researcher who is like a good researcher should be in search of the truth. And he set up this design where he went to the Los Angeles County Cancer Registry and got the names of 1,100 people who had cancer of the head and neck, and then found a control group of people of similar age, sex, and geographic neighborhood, and took a look at the relationship of lung cancer to smoking cannabis. And I'm not sure if he looked at the relationship to tobacco, which we already know, but he knew that cannabis did contain carcinogens. And no one, I think, was more surprised than Tashkin to find that the more cannabis that you smoked, the less likely you were to get lung cancer. And of course, that's because we know that cannabis in mice and in tissue culture kills cancer cells. And as Dr. Donald Abrams, who is an oncologist at the University of California at San Francisco, has said, there's more than enough basic science research and anecdotal evidence to justify doing double-blind studies to see whether or not cannabis actually does cure cancer, or at the very least, extend life expectancy. And we have had the first such study that was done in England with Sativex. Now, I think that these people probably received what I would call homeopathic dosages. That's too low a dose to actually be extremely effective. But what they found, if you use Sativex, and I think they used 25 milligrams of THC and 25 milligrams of CBD. I'm not positive. It's only recently that that's been published, and I haven't had a chance to read it. But they found that people who had glioblastoma, which is a brain tumor that we know to be sensitive to cannabis, who were diagnosed and had no treatment with cannabis, had conventional treatment, had a life expectancy of about 330 days, and people who received this low dose of sublingual sprayed cannabis, tincture cannabis, had a life expectancy of like 520 days. So, I mean, this is something that's real. It's something that's significant. I frankly think if they used higher dosages, that the difference between the life expectancy of the untreated and the treated population would be greater. So there was also an article out of the University of Wisconsin in 2008, which I think the title was something like Cannabis and Cannabinoids, Promise and Progress, pointing out that there were at least 15 different cell types that in mice and in tissue culture were responsive to cannabis in terms of killing the cancer cells. And the way in which the researchers have suggested that cannabis does this is it inhibits angiogenesis, the formation of new blood vessels, which means that the cancer tissue, which like any tissue needs to be nourished by oxygen and sugar, is not going to be nourished, not going to survive. It also interferes or inhibits the ID1 gene, which is responsible for metastasis. So you either have no or less metastasis. And it stimulates apoptosis, which is programmed cell death, particularly of old and abnormal cells. And the real amazing thing about cannabis for cancer is that it targets the abnormal cells and leaves the normal cells away. So this is what's happening when you smoke cannabis. Yes, you are irritating the bronchial tree. And as Tashkin has said, smoking cannabis causes a precancerous condition. It does not cause cancer. And many studies have shown that it can cause cancer to get smaller and can kill cancer cells. So this is just another shibboleth, you say that, about the adverse effects of cannabis. I mean, what I think your listeners would be well to ponder on is that almost everything negative that's been said about cannabis is 180 degrees wrong.
I think that's what a lot of the research coming out now, especially there was a study which came out about dementia in mice. They found that low doses of cannabis actually reversed the aging of the brain.
Right, and cannabis is neuroprotective. Dr. Raphael Mechoulam, who is the scientist who characterized the chemical structure of THC in 1964 and has been working on this ever since, developed a synthetic cannabinoid called dexabanol, which he demonstrated was useful in neuroprotection if you had a stroke or if you had a traumatic brain injury. So the lie that cannabis causes brain damage came from probably one of the most notorious pieces of junk science ever done, which was done in the 1970s by a very overzealous researcher with an agenda. He exposed monkeys to marijuana smoke, and then he sacrificed the monkeys, checked their brains, and there was no brain damage. Well, he was disappointed with that, so he put gas masks on the monkeys and again piped in marijuana smoke, sacrificed the monkeys, and of course they had brain damage, not from the marijuana, but from oxygen deprivation. So, I mean, he proved something that we've known for hundreds, if not thousands of years, that oxygen deprivation is not good for the brain. And, you know, it's these kinds of studies that are just poor science and absolutely wrong and are never duplicated by anybody that the neo-prohibitionists refer to. And what they are doing is interfering with our ability to have good health and our ability to treat patients. And one of the things that I hope that we see as we get a return to sanity is the use of cannabis as a preventive. Remember that I am a clinical physician and that physicians are experts in disease and not health. So I hope that we see the nutritionists and more input from the naturopaths and the herbologists in terms of the use of cannabis as a nutraceutical. And we recognize that in addition to being an herbal medicine, it's also a vegetable.
Is there enough education at the moment in our current medical system on the endocannabinoid system?
It's appalling. There was a study. No, the simple answer is no. There was a survey that was done by David Allen, who's a cardiologist in the States, and he just contacted all the medical schools in the United States a few years ago and found out that only 13% of the American medical schools discuss the endocannabinoid system. Wow. I gave a talk at Grand Rounds at the hospital here in Christchurch, and I asked a show of hands of the students that had been taught about the endocannabinoid system. And I didn't look closely, but I think I saw 3 or 4 hands that were raised in an audience that had a couple of hundred people. And there's even less discussion about the medicinal value of cannabis. I mean, there are a few schools that do it. Now, in California, the University of California at San Diego is the headquarters for the California Medicinal Cannabis Research Center. I think they do a little bit of education there. I know that the cardiologists that I see went to UCLA and that they do some education there of their medical students. But the medical schools that teach anything about the endocannabinoid system are few and far between, and the medical schools that even discuss the potential for cannabis as a medicine or the mechanisms of action are even fewer.
I've got one last question for you, David. In New Zealand, one of the only legal medicinal cannabis products which we have access to is Sativex, and that comes with quite a hefty price tag of about $1,600 a month, which is quite expensive. And I was talking to you about this earlier about how Pharmac, our New Zealand subsidy organisation, which subsidises all the pharmaceuticals, refused to subsidise Sativex on the basis that it has the ability to be abused recreationally. What do you have to say about that, especially in light of, say, opioid abuse?
I think whoever came to that conclusion should be sacked. The fact of the matter is that the Sativex people don't want their drug to be abused, and they created it specifically not to be abused. Why is it not abused? Because it's a 1-to-1 ratio of THC to CBD, and the CBD partially interferes with the euphoria or the dysphoria that can be caused by THC. That's number one. Number two, it's in a metered sprayer, so you can only get a limited dose, and you can only get it on occasion. You can only get it a few times a day. So the fact of the matter is that these people don't know what they're doing. It's a lot like the Medical Board of California, who's supposed to assess quality and doesn't know what they're doing. And I say that as the former medical director and director of the Health Services Department of the oldest Medicaid managed care program in the United States, one of whose responsibilities was quality of care. I also have had almost 50 years experience in doing drug abuse treatment and prevention, and to equate abuse from Sativex with opiates is laughable and is basically a waste of your breath to say so and a waste of paper to put pencil to paper on and say so. I mean, it is one of the more absurd conclusions that I have heard in regards to the way that bureaucrats around the world respond to cannabis, and there have been a great many absurdities.
There have been. We can definitely agree on that. David's book is Drugs Are Not the Devil's Tools: How Discrimination and Greed Created a Dysfunctional Drug Policy and How It Can Be Fixed. If you would like to read this book, we'll put some links up in the podcast notes. David, thank you very much for taking the time out of your very busy schedule. We really appreciate you sharing this information and for your awesome talks around New Zealand. This is really going to help create real change in New Zealand.
I want to thank you very much, and I want to recognize the Green Party and the National Party and other people in your MPs who are looking at reform and are trying to educate themselves. And I want to thank the welcome that I have received so far here in New Zealand, and I want to thank you for interviewing me.
Excellent. Thank you very much, David.